born human in a Neolithic settlement on the banks of the Sakarya River in what is now Turkey, approximately 8,000 years before the Common Era. By the time of the events we're about to discuss, he had been alive for something close to 38,000 years. He had personally outlasted every civilization humanity had ever built. He had watched every empire, from the ancient kingdoms of the Nile to the industrialized nation-states of the 20th century, rise, burn, and collapse. He had, according to several accounts, guided that history from behind various names and faces, sometimes as a conqueror, sometimes as a philosopher, always as something more than he appeared to be. When he finally stopped hiding and announced himself to the world, the consequences were immediate. He launched the Unification Wars, conquering the fractured city-states and warlord empires of a war-ravaged Earth through a combination of military force and the kind of psychic presence that made opposition feel like a very bad idea. He united humanity on one planet. Then he built a fleet. Then he started uniting humanity across the galaxy. He was the most powerful psychic human being who had ever existed, ranked above everyone else in the history of the species. His psychic sense extended across star systems. His ability to project his presence meant that even at a distance, the Emperor didn't merely communicate, he arrived. His aura was powerful enough that people fell to their knees in his presence without deciding to. He fashioned suns from his own DNA and psychic material, effectively demigods, each one capable of commanding hundreds of thousands of enhanced warriors. He powered a psychic lighthouse so enormous it lit the entire dimension of warp space, allowing 10,000 ships to navigate through it without getting lost in the nightmares that lived there. His official position on all of this was that he wasn't a god. He was a human being, an unusually old and capable one, but mortal in category and nature, no different in kind from the billions of ordinary humans who built the civilization around him. He might have actually believed it. This story takes place in Warhammer 40,000, Games Workshop's science fantasy setting, expanded over 40 years into one of the most elaborate invented mythologies in existence. It's set roughly in the 41st millennium of the Common Era, and it isn't a happy place. The galaxy is at war with itself, with alien species, and with literal entities born from the collective emotional output of every sentient mind that has ever lived. If you've never heard of this setting, that sentence was deliberate. The scale of this universe is part of why the contradiction at its center is so spectacular. The Emperor of Mankind is the founding figure of the Imperium of Man, humanity's civilization, spanning millions of planets and trillions of souls. He built it. He designed its institutions. He led its armies in person for decades, then handed command to his favored son and went underground to work on what he believed was the most important project in human history. The thesis is simple, and it doesn't get more complicated. The Emperor possessed every functional attribute of a god by any reasonable definition. He refused to acknowledge this, persistently and institutionally, and that refusal handed his enemies the greatest weapon they ever used against him. His denial cost him his sons, his dream, and eventually his life. The specific tragedy is that he understood the mechanism of his own failure better than almost anyone alive. He just couldn't see that it applied to himself. The Emperor's origin story exists in two versions, and both arrive at the same place. The older account says he was assembled rather than born, that roughly 50 prehistoric shamans, the most psychically powerful human beings of the Neolithic period, sacrificed themselves and pooled their essence into a single vessel to prevent their accumulated wisdom from scattering to reincarnation cycles and being lost. A consortium of dying seers, everything they were compressed into one being. The more recent canonical account says something stranger in its own way, that he was simply born, a child of normal parents near the Sakarya River, but his psychic power was so extreme at the moment of birth that it rewrote his biology in the womb, altering his genome to prevent aging, prevent death, prevent the cellular decay that ends a human life. From his first breath, he was categorically different from every other human who had ever lived. Whatever the origin, the result is the same. A being of absolute psychic supremacy who had existed, learning and planning and watching for the entire span of recorded human civilization. By the time anyone had heard of him, he was already older than the concept of a week. The technical term the lore uses for what he is, a perpetual, a vanishingly rare category of human whose psychic power is sufficient to override death. They regenerate from wounds, resist corruption, and when they die, they eventually return. The Emperor was the first human psyker and the most powerful, and he had been demonstrating this particular quality since before Mesopotamia existed. He didn't have good genes. He was a human being for whom death had become, on an ongoing basis, optional. 38,000 years of direct observation, perfect memory, and accumulating power, and when asked about his nature, his official position was that he was a man. When the Emperor launched the Great Crusade, the military campaign to reconnect the scattered human worlds of the galaxy under a single imperium, he implemented a doctrine called the imperial truth, state-mandated atheism. Religion wasn't simply discouraged, it was actively suppressed. The imperium offered knowledge and reason. Gods weren't real, couldn't be demonstrated, and wouldn't be tolerated. The emperor wasn't simply anti-religious in the way a frustrated rationalist might be. He had a specific strategic reason for this policy, and it rested on genuine expertise. He understood the warp. The warp is the parallel dimension that underlies physical space in this universe, the dimension through which faster-than-light travel is possible, and also the dimension where psychic energy pools and condenses into entities. The four great chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nergal, and Slaanesh, exist there as beings formed from the accumulated psychic output of every sentient mind in the galaxy. Khorne grows from every act of rage and killing. Nergal feeds on despair and the slow surrender to entropy. Tzeentch is built from ambition and the compulsive need for change. Slaanesh draws power from sensation pushed past pleasure into obsession. They aren't metaphorical. They aren't symbolic. In this universe, they are entities of genuine power that reach into the physical world and corrupt it, and they grow stronger from worship. Directed belief is psychic energy, and psychic energy is the substance they are built from. The emperor knew this. Banning religion was an attempt to starve these entities of their primary fuel source. No worship, no growth, no power. Simple in theory, eliminate the supply chain and the predator weakens. The flaw in this reasoning wasn't the reasoning itself. The flaw was the assumption that the emperor existed outside the system he was trying to manage. The prosecution's first exhibit is the Primarchs, and they deserve examination on their own terms. At some point before the Great Crusade, the emperor constructed 20 warriors in genetic laboratories beneath what would become the imperial palace on Terra. He used his own DNA, his own psychic material, aspects of his own being as the raw material. Each Primarch was designed to be the supreme military commander of a Space Marine Legion. Already superhuman soldiers, each one enhanced using gene seed derived from the Primarch's own biology, which traced in turn directly back to the Emperor. 20 demigods, each commanding hundreds of thousands of warriors who inherited their enhanced capabilities from copies of the demigod's biology, which copied the Emperor's. That is a biological hierarchy of the type that every theological tradition the Emperor had watched emerge over 38,000 years would have immediately recognized. The apex source, the intermediate divine figures, the mortal army. He had been alive when most of those traditions were invented. He would have known exactly what the structure looked like from the outside. The Chaos Gods intercepted the Primarchs during their gestation, scattering them across the galaxy. The Emperor spent the early years of the Great Crusade finding them and reclaiming them. Each reunion was, by most accounts, overwhelming. A moment of recognition between a father and a son formed from his father's substance, separated and returned against all odds. Lorgar Aurelian had been found on a world called Colchis, raised by a man named Kor-Pharon in a culture of deep religious devotion. He arrived at his father already shaped by a framework that understood existence as pointing toward the divine. When he encountered the emperor, the religious instinct that had been his defining characteristic from childhood fastened onto his father with the force of a conversion experience. His father was genuinely extraordinary by any observable measure. His father had powers that nothing in Lorgar's theological framework could account for except divine origin. His father had created him from his own substance. If that wasn't a creator and creation relationship, Lorgar didn't have the vocabulary for what it was. Lorgar was the most spiritually and theologically minded of the emperor's sons. Where some of his brothers were soldiers first and everything else second, Lorgar was a builder, a thinker, a theologian. His world had given him a framework in which faith wasn't weakness but foundation. The argument that a civilization built on belief could endure things that a civilization built on pure reason would shatter under. He wasn't wrong about the principle. He was applying it to the wrong object. He wrote a book, the Lectitio Divinitatis, a theological treatise arguing, in considered terms, that the emperor of mankind was a divine being and that worshipping him wasn't merely acceptable but necessary and true. It spread quietly through the crusade fleets, passed hand to hand among soldiers and civilians who found in it a framework for the awe they already felt and had been told they weren't allowed to express. An underground cult formed around it. Monarchia was its cathedral. On the world of Kur, Lorgar built a city as an act of worship in architectural form. Every street, every building, every public space was designed to express and facilitate devotion to the emperor. The people who lived there weren't just citizens. They were congregants, organizing their lives around the belief Lorgar had codified in his book. Monarchia was the proof of concept for what the Imperium could be, not merely a political empire, but a holy one. Lorgar's supreme achievement and most complete statement of what he believed the galaxy was for. The Emperor ordered it destroyed. He dispatched Rabute Gilliman and the Ultramarines, the most disciplined legion in the Crusade, the sons of the Primarch who most embodied the ideals of the imperial truth, to Kur. They didn't simply damage the city, they burned it. When Lorgar and the word-bearers arrived, what greeted them was smoke and rubble, the Ultramarines standing in the ruins and the Emperor waiting beyond them. What followed isn't disputed in the lore's substance. The Emperor made the entire Word-Bearers Legion kneel in the ashes of Monarchia. Every soldier, every commander. Tens of thousands of warriors, on their knees in the ruins of the thing they had built to honor the man standing over them. The imperial truth was law. Worship was forbidden. The Word-Bearers had wasted the Crusades' time building temples when worlds still needed conquering. Everything Lorgar had done in his father's name was a mistake, a violation, and the Emperor was making that clear in this particular location, in front of everyone who mattered. He departed, and he left behind a son who had been shown, beyond any possibility of doubt, that his devotion wasn't merely unwelcome, it was punishable. Lorgar's response to Monarchia is the pivot point of the entire Horus heresy, and it does not get the weight it deserves. He didn't become an atheist. He didn't conclude that his father was right and religion was a mistake. What Lorgar actually did was conclude that his instinct was correct and his target was wrong. The need to worship something genuine was real and powerful, and the Emperor had refused it without providing any alternative. Lorgar was constituted for devotion. That capacity wasn't going away. It just needed a worthier recipient. He went looking. The pilgrimage Lorgar undertook after Monarchia eventually took him to the Eye of Terror, the great wound in physical space where the warp bleeds visibly into the material universe. He was searching for genuine divine beings, ones that wouldn't burn his cities, ones that wouldn't force him to kneel in his own ashes. He found the four chaos gods. Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh didn't tell Lorgar that worship was a mistake. They had been waiting, in the warp, for exactly the kind of devoted attention that the emperor had been so assiduously redirecting away from anything useful. They accepted Lorgar's devotion without reservation. That was, quite literally, what they existed to do. Lorgar emerged from the Eye of Terror a different man. He wrote the Book of Lorgar as the theological foundation for chaos worship. He tasked his first chaplain Erebus and his adoptive father, Cor Pharaon, with converting the Word-Bearers Legion. Quietly, systematically, world by world, and soldier by soldier, from space marines with religious feelings into dedicated servants of the chaos gods. The conversion was thorough and patient. By the time anyone outside the Legion knew something had changed, the change was complete. The Emperor had banned religion to prevent the chaos gods from gaining influence over humanity. His most religious son, cut off from any sanctioned expression of the impulse that defined him, gave the chaos gods an entire legion. The bitterest irony of the imperial truth is that it worked exactly as designed on everyone except the person who needed it most. Lorgar wasn't simply looking for personal satisfaction. He was patient, and he was building something. One converted legion wasn't enough to challenge the Emperor. What was needed was a war. For a war, he needed the War Master. Horus Lupercal was the Emperor's most favored son. When the Emperor stepped back from personally leading the Great Crusade and returned to Terra, he gave Horus command of the entire campaign. Every legion, every fleet, every ongoing operation across the galaxy fell under his authority. This wasn't ceremonial. Horus commanded in the Emperor's name with the Emperor's full authority, and everyone understood what that meant. He was also a being with doubts. He loved his father and had given everything to the crusade. But the Emperor had left. He had returned to Terra and disappeared into a project no one was allowed to visit or question. The man who had fought at Horus's side for decades was now effectively unreachable. Messages from the front arrived late and filtered. The absence wasn't just physical, it was total. Approximately 40 years before the heresy broke into open war, Lorgar ordered the conspiracy into motion. His first chaplain Erebus became the primary instrument. Horus was brought to the world of Davin, where the chaos gods arranged something precise: a vision. In the visions given to Horus at Davin, he was shown a specific future. He saw the Imperium as it would become after the Emperor's apotheosis, a civilization of trillions worshipping the Emperor as a literal god. Shrines and temples and prayers, the entire architecture of the religion the Emperor had forbidden, constructed around his father's name. In this future, Horus and his brothers had been forgotten. The sons who had fought and bled to build that empire didn't exist within it. The father remained, elevated to divinity, while everything the Primarchs had sacrificed had been written over. The Chaos Gods had taken the Emperor's denial of godhood and turned it into a weapon. Not by arguing against the denial, by confirming it. Yes, the Emperor would become a god, and Horus would be nothing. The wound that cracked Horus open was structurally identical to the wound Monarchia had opened in Lorgar. The gap between the Emperor's stated nature and his actual trajectory. The denial wasn't protection. It was a lie with a consequence attached. Horus turned. While the conspiracy was assembling itself out of his sight, the Emperor was underground. He had sequestered himself beneath the imperial palace to work on what he considered the most important undertaking in human history. The Webway, the interdimensional travel network built by the Eldar, the ancient alien civilization that had preceded humanity as the galaxy's dominant species, was a web of passages through subdimensional space, allowing travel between distant points without using the warp at all. Ships moving through it weren't exposed to the Chaos Gods. The risks that came with conventional warp travel simply didn't apply. The Emperor was building a human branch of this network, hub beneath the Imperial Palace. If completed, humanity could travel the galaxy without touching the warp at all, starving the Chaos Gods of the psychic contamination that came with every conventional journey through their domain. He considered it the project that would change everything. It required his full, continuous, personal attention. So his sons commanded their legions in his name and received guidance through Malkador the Sigillite, the emperor's regent, the second most powerful human psyker in the Imperium, the man administering an empire while its architect worked underground. When Primarchs wanted to reach their father, they couldn't. Reports from the front were filtered and slow. The Lorgar conspiracy was constructing itself above a man who had made himself inaccessible to the people who needed to warn him. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legion, was the most psychically gifted of the Primarchs after the Emperor himself. A scholar and practitioner of the highest order, deeply invested in understanding the warp as a phenomenon rather than simply a weapon. When Magnus discovered that Horus had turned traitor, that the War Master was preparing a rebellion, the conventional routes to the Imperial Palace were sealed. So Magnus used psychic power to project a warning directly to Terra. The message arrived. It also, by the lore's account, tore through the Emperor's webway project like a stone thrown through glass, shattering work that had taken years in a single uncontrolled burst. The Emperor had recently convened the Council of Nicaea, an assembly of scholars and primarchs, to determine policy on psychic power within the legions. The council had resulted in restrictions on unsanctioned psychic use. Magnus had argued against those restrictions and lost. His warning about Horus technically violated the decree. The Emperor didn't thank Magnus for the warning. The Space Wolves Legion, under Primarch Leman Russ, was dispatched to Prospero, Magnus's homeworld. What was ordered as an arrest became, in execution, a devastation. Prospero burned. The Thousand Sons were shattered. Magnus, who had risked everything to warn his father of the greatest threat the Imperium would ever face, lost his legion and his world for the attempt. Hold that against the Emperor's own nature for a moment. The most powerful psychic human in history. A being whose entire existence rested on psychic ability so extreme it had defeated death for 38,000 years. The Astronomicon, the lighthouse that enabled all warp travel across the Imperium, ran on his own projected consciousness. He wasn't merely a psyker. He was the defining example of what psychic power could be. He punished his devoted son for using psychic power. The Council of Nicaea's restrictions, whatever their intended scope, didn't apply to the Emperor. His son, trying to reach him with critical information through the only channel that worked, was destroyed for mirroring the exact capability his father had built his entire existence upon. Two of the Emperor's most devoted sons had now been broken by the same underlying pattern. Lorgar, who worshipped with all the devotional capacity constitutionally his, was humiliated for it. Magnus, who used psychic power with all the ability he had inherited, was punished for it. Both were being penalized for reflecting back, in their specific domains, exactly what the Emperor was and had always been. When Horus raised his banner in open rebellion, the consequences were as total as the preparation had been thorough. Horus wasn't a general who had changed sides. He was the war master, with the personal loyalty of half the Primarchs and half the legions, the organizational apparatus of the entire crusade, and the backing of 4 entities that had been waiting decades for precisely this moment. The word-bearers, already fully converted, already fanatical, provided the ideological core. Lorgar moved through the rebellion, spreading the influence of the Chaos Gods with the same structured dedication he had once given to the Lectitio Divinitatis. He had not stopped being devout. He had simply found recipients worthy of devotion. The architect of the galaxy's conversion to the imperial truth became the architect of its conversion to chaos. The heresy burned across the galaxy for years. Worlds died. Legions destroyed each other. The civilization that had been decades in the building began to unmake itself. It ended on Terra. Horus's forces breached the outer defenses of the Imperial Palace after a siege that killed on a scale that strains description. The Emperor teleported directly to Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, for a confrontation that was as much psychic as physical. Malkador the Sigillite had held the Golden Throne through the siege. He deserves more than a passing reference. He was the emperor's regent, the second most powerful human psyker in the Imperium, the man who had served as the emperor's closest advisor since before the crusade began, who had administered an empire for decades while its founder worked underground. Sitting in the Golden Throne, maintaining the functions the emperor normally provided, while the emperor fought his way across the palace, burned through everything Malkador had left. When the emperor returned, Malkador was gone. He gave whatever remained of his life to keep the machine running until his master came back to it. The emperor came back to it broken. Horus, elevated by the full combined power of all four chaos gods, had inflicted wounds on the emperor that no human body could survive. The emperor, in turn, destroyed Horus so completely, soul and self utterly erased, that the chaos gods couldn't resurrect him. It ended the rebellion by ending the only figure who could have led it through what came next. His sons carried him back to Terra in pieces. The Webway project was unworkable. Magnus's warning had seen to that. The machine built for the project was repurposed. The Emperor was placed in it. The Golden Throne is a life support apparatus of extraordinary psychic sophistication. The Emperor has been on it for over 10,000 years. He isn't dead in the technical sense. His psychic presence still functions. He still powers the Astronomicon, still maintains the infrastructure that keeps warp travel possible across the Imperium. But he can't speak, can't move, can't direct or advise or correct anything done in his name. He is a consciousness in a machine, sustained by the deaths of thousands of human psychers sacrificed to feed the throne's requirements every single day. The Imperium of Man has had a state religion for most of those 10,000 years. The Ecclesiarchy, the official church of the God Emperor, administers the spiritual lives of trillions across millions of worlds. Every shrine in human space carries his image. Every battle is fought in his name. Prayers go up to him constantly from a civilization so vast that the combined psychic weight of that directed belief has, by several accounts in the lore, actually completed the apotheosis he spent his whole existence trying to prevent. 10,000 years of worship from a trillion-soul civilization may have genuinely elevated him to the status of a warp entity, the precise category of thing the imperial truth was designed to prevent humanity from creating. The Lectitio Divinitatis, the text written by Lorgar Aurelian, the first Primarch to fall to chaos, the son publicly humiliated in the ashes of a city built to honor the man who refused to be honored, is the founding document of the Imperium's state religion. The first heretic wrote the Catechism. Across 10,000 years, the man executed by proxy through Monarchia's destruction has gotten the last word. The human sacrifice the imperial truth was designed to render unnecessary is now a daily institutional ritual. The worship the emperor banned is now the primary social bond holding the Imperium together. The civilization he built to be rational, secular, and durable has survived by becoming the thing he spent his entire existence trying to prevent. The prosecution case is complete, and it doesn't require embellishment. The emperor was right that worship was dangerous. He understood the mechanism with a precision that very few beings in the galaxy could match. He knew directed belief was psychic fuel, and that psychic fuel fed the entities in the warp that wanted to consume humanity. The imperial truth wasn't arrogance. It was, in its own terms, a genuine strategic calculation made from a position of better information than almost anyone else possessed. But the imperial truth's blind spot was its author. The emperor could analyze the danger of worship in every direction except the one pointing at himself. He could see Lorgar's devotion as a problem to be suppressed. He couldn't see that suppressing it without providing any alternative was equivalent to building a dam and ignoring the pressure accumulating behind it. The flood doesn't disappear because you've told the river it isn't allowed to rise. Lorgar's impulse was real. It didn't die in Monarchia's ashes. It found the Eye of Terror and came back with 4 gods behind it. Magnus's warning was real. It didn't stop mattering because it violated a decree. It got his world burned and pushed him toward the exact corruption the decree was meant to prevent. Horus's betrayal was built from a specific wound, the gap between what the emperor claimed to be and what the chaos gods showed him the emperor would become. Every catastrophic failure of the heresy traces a line back to the same point. 2 readings of this story are both true, and the honest accounting requires holding them simultaneously. One reads, "Here is a man who spent tens of thousands of years planning for humanity's survival, who understood the dangers with a clarity no one else possessed, who banned religion not from arrogance, but because he genuinely believed directed belief would feed the things that wanted to devour his species. He made errors. The isolation of the Webway project was a miscalculation. The humiliation of Lorgar was brutal and counterproductive. But he was trying, with everything he had, to build something that would last. And the fact that it broke says something about the difficulty of the project, as well as the character of the builder." The other reads, "He had more information than anyone alive. He understood the mechanism of his own failure in advance, and he still couldn't apply that analysis to himself. He could identify worship as dangerous in everyone except its primary object. He penalized sons for reflecting exactly what he was. He buried himself in a project while his family fell apart above him. He was right about everything and got everything wrong anyway." Neither reading is complete without the other. The tragedy isn't a monster losing. It's a man, or something that called itself a man, who may have genuinely believed what he said and was destroyed by the precise distance between the belief and the truth, between the self-image and the functional reality. That gap is where Lorgar went looking for something genuine. It's where Magnus was punished for being like his father. It's where Horus found the knife. He was right that worship was dangerous. He was wrong that denying his own divinity would stop it. And somewhere in that machine on Terra, if any consciousness remains in what the lore calls the corpse emperor on his throne, there is a being who has had 10,000 years of immobility and silence to understand exactly what the evidence shows. While 1,000,000,000,000 souls pray to his image, while thousands are sacrificed every day to keep him breathing, while the civilization he spent 38,000 years building worships him as the god he spent 38,000 years insisting he wasn't. The god on the throne can't even open his eyes to see it. If you found your way here through Space Marine 2 and you're just starting to pull on this universe's threads, be warned, they don't stop. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper.